Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to tell a story that redefined human civilization. A story that begins not with a bang, but with a question. Imagine the world in the late 15th century. To most Europeans, the known world was a massive landmass surrounded by a dark and terrifying ocean. The most prized goods, spices, silks, and precious stones came from the distant and legendary lands of Asia. But the paths to the east were treacherous. The overland Silk Road was long, dangerous, and controlled by rival empires, and the sea route around Africa was a grueling multi-year voyage. But what if you didn't have to go east? What if, a visionary man wondered, you could simply sail west to get to the east? This audacious idea, born from a mix of ambition, faith, and a deep scientific miscalculation, would propel a single man into history and plunge two separate worlds into a violent and irrevocable collision. Tonight, we explore the epic, often brutal, journey of the Age of Exploration, a time of breathtaking discovery, immense cruelty, and the forging of a new global order. So get comfortable, because we're about to set sail into the most transformative century in human history. You might even say it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Our story begins with Christopher Columbus, a man born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa, Italy in 1451. He wasn't a noble, but a sailor and a self-taught navigator. For years, he lived and breathed the ocean, traveling the seas from England to Africa. But it was his grand theory that truly defined him. Columbus was convinced the world was much smaller than his peers believed, and that a westward journey to Asia was not only possible, but a more efficient route. He was driven by more than just trade. He was a man of intense religious conviction who believed God had chosen him to spread Christianity and find the riches needed to fund a new crusade. He spent nearly a decade trying to sell his vision to the crowned heads of Europe. He traveled to Portugal, the leading naval power of the era, only to be rejected by their court. Their royal advisors, with far more accurate calculations about the size of the earth, saw his plan as wildly impractical and his demands for titles and a share of the profits as excessive. He was laughed out of the courts of England and France. It wasn't until 1492, after years of pleading, that he found a sympathetic ear in Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II of Spain. They were eager to catch up with their rival Portugal, and the promise of untold wealth and new converts for the church was a risk they were finally willing to take. They provided him with 3 small ships, a crew of 90 men, and a mandate: find a new route to the east. On a summer morning in August 1492, the 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, departed from Spain. The voyage was an act of pure faith. Sailors of the time were not afraid of falling off a flat earth, but they were terrified of the unknown. They feared running out of supplies, being lost forever in the vastness of the sea, or being attacked by giant sea monsters from folklore. As weeks turned into months and the crew saw nothing but the endless horizon, their fear turned to mutiny. Columbus, a master of persuasion and a man with an unbreakable will, convinced them to press on for just a few more days. It was a bluff, but a lucky one. On October 12, 1492, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land. The relief and joy were immeasurable. They had not found the shores of Asia as Columbus believed, but a small island in the Bahamas. He named it San Salvador and planted the Spanish flag. The people who greeted them, the peaceful Taíno people, were unlike anything the Europeans had ever seen. They were friendly and curious, offering the explorers food and water. Columbus, in a monumental case of mistaken identity, immediately called them Indians, believing he had reached the East Indies. He also made a chilling observation in his journal. He saw them wearing small pieces of gold. He also noted that they were unarmed and generous, and in a deeply troubling passage, he wrote that they would make fine servants. It was a moment of profound misjudgment, one that would foreshadow a catastrophic future. Columbus returned to Spain a hero. He brought back not only gold, but also exotic plants, animals, and several of the captured Taino. His success prompted the Spanish monarchs to fund a second, much larger expedition. In 1493, a fleet of 17 ships and 1,200 men set sail, not just with sailors, but with soldiers, priests, and colonists. The objective was no longer just exploration, it was conquest. Columbus established the first permanent European settlement, La Isabela, on the island of Hispaniola. But this time, the peaceful contact was over. The Spanish colonists, driven by a relentless lust for gold, quickly subjected the Taino to a forced labor system. They demanded that every Taino over the age of 14 deliver a hawksbill full of gold every 3 months. When they couldn't, their hands were cut off. This brutal tribute system, coupled with the introduction of European diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the Taino had no immunity, with a genocidal combination. Within a few decades, the entire Taino population of Hispaniola was nearly wiped out. For his part, Columbus was a disastrous governor. His violent rule led to mutiny among his own men, and he was eventually arrested and sent back to Spain in chains, disgraced.
While Columbus's reputation faded, his discoveries had already lit a fire under the European powers. The Spanish crown, eager to secure its new territory, went to the Pope to legitimize its claims. In 1494, a papal bull resulted in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew an imaginary line of demarcation down the Atlantic. All newly discovered lands to the west of the line belonged to Spain, and all lands to the east of it belonged to Portugal. This single document, signed by 2 European nations, carved up the entire globe without any consideration for the millions of people who already lived there. This treaty set the stage for an intense race for global dominance. Portugal, led by navigators like Vasco da Gama, focused on the eastern route, establishing a vast trading empire in India and Southeast Asia. But they also made a fateful discovery. An accidental landfall by Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500 on the coast of South America led to the claim of Brazil for Portugal. Meanwhile, other nations refused to be left behind. England sent John Cabot to explore the northern coast of North America, laying the groundwork for a future empire. The continents themselves were named after another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, who, unlike Columbus, realized he had discovered a new world, not Asia.
The true wealth of the Americas, however, was not in the Caribbean islands, but on the mainland, where 2 powerful empires existed. In 1519, a Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés arrived in what is now Mexico with a small force of 500 men. He would go on to conquer the formidable Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions led by the Emperor Moctezuma II. Cortés was a master strategist. He exploited old animosities, forming alliances with tribes that were resentful of Aztec rule. His military advantage lay not just in steel weapons and guns, but in a psychological terror he wielded with the help of horses. The conquest of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was a brutal affair, but the most devastating weapon of all wasn't steel or gunpowder, it was disease. A smallpox epidemic brought by the Spanish swept through the Aztec population, killing a staggering percentage of their people and leaving the empire weakened and vulnerable. The conquest of the Aztecs brought unimaginable wealth to Spain, but it was just the beginning. A few years later, Francisco Pizarro would replicate this model of conquest in South America, marching into the Andes and toppling the immense Inca Empire through a combination of deception and superior military force. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas triggered one of the most significant events in human history, the Columbian Exchange. This was a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. The exchange fundamentally reshaped global ecology and human society. From the Americas, Europe received crops that would become staples of the global diet: corn, potatoes, and tomatoes. The potato, in particular, was a nutritional powerhouse that ended famines and fueled a population explosion across Europe. Cacao, which would become chocolate, and tobacco also became global commodities. In return, Europeans brought a host of new items to the Americas. They introduced horses, which revolutionized hunting and warfare for many Native American tribes on the plains. They also brought cattle, pigs, and sheep, changing the landscape of the continents. But the exchange was not all positive. Europeans brought diseases, and the impact was nothing short of apocalyptic. The Native American populations, isolated for thousands of years, had no natural immunity to illnesses like smallpox, measles, and influenza. The death toll was staggering, with some historians estimating that up to 90% of the indigenous population perished in the first century after contact. The destruction of this population had a profound economic and social impact, setting the stage for yet another tragic chapter. The massive depopulation of Native Americans created a critical labor shortage for the European colonists. As the demand for crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco grew, the colonists looked for a new source of labor. This led to the development of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the most brutal and inhumane systems in history. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were captured from their homes, packed into the holds of ships in what became known as the Middle Passage, and transported across the Atlantic to be sold into chattel slavery. The journey itself was horrific, with an estimated 15 to 20% of enslaved people dying at sea. Once they arrived in the Americas, they were forced to work under brutal conditions on plantations, their lives and freedom stripped away. This system was especially prevalent in the Caribbean and Brazil, where sugar plantations were a driving force of the colonial economy. The wealth generated from this system, built on the suffering of millions, fueled the rise of European empires and laid the foundation for deep-seated racial injustices that persist to this day. The age of exploration, born of a desire for new wealth, was now tragically intertwined with the systematic dehumanization of an entire race.
While Spain and Portugal dominated the southern part of the Americas, other European powers were carving out their own spheres of influence to the north. The French, led by explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, were primarily interested in the lucrative fur trade. They established colonies along the St. Lawrence River in what is now Canada and forged alliances with Native American tribes like the Huron and Algonquin. Their numbers were smaller than the Spanish, and they tended to live among the native populations as traders rather than large-scale farmers, creating a more symbiotic, though still complex, relationship. The English, on the other hand, had a different vision. They wanted to establish permanent, self-sustaining settlements. Their first successful colony was Jamestown, founded in 1607. Its early years were marked by starvation, disease, and conflict with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. But the English persisted, and the colony eventually thrived with the introduction of tobacco as a cash crop. This was followed by the arrival of the Puritans in 1620, who founded the Plymouth colony. They sought religious freedom and aimed to create a new society, a city upon a hill, based on their strict religious principles. Their vision, however, came at the expense of Native American tribes whose land they settled and whose populations were decimated by disease and warfare. And then there were the Dutch, who established a small but influential presence in North America with the founding of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City. They were primarily a trading power, and their colony was known for its commercial focus and tolerance for various religions, a stark contrast to the rigid Puritan society to the north. Their legacy, though brief, would be a lasting one.
By the 18th century, the Americas were no longer new, but a collection of diverse and distinct societies, all tied to their European colonial masters. This was the dawn of a truly global economy. The silver and gold from Spanish mines fueled European trade and financed wars. The sugar from the Caribbean, the tobacco from Virginia, and the furs from Canada were all integral parts of a complex web of commerce that connected continents. This era saw the rise of global trading companies and the development of modern capitalism. But the price of this new global order was immense. The indigenous populations were shattered, their cultures pushed to the brink of extinction. The labor of enslaved Africans built the economies of the New World, and their contributions were systematically erased from the historical record. The ideas of freedom and self-determination that would one day lead to revolutions in the Americas were born from the very act of colonization, as the colonists themselves began to resent the distant rule of their European kings. The legacy of this period is a complicated one, filled with contradictions. It gave us the modern world with all its interconnectedness, but it also left a trail of violence and injustice that is still felt today.
In the centuries that followed, the story of the Age of Exploration became a tale of heroes and discovery. Christopher Columbus was celebrated as a courageous visionary who discovered America, but in recent decades, a more complete and honest picture has emerged. We now understand that the term New World ignores the millions of people who lived there for thousands of years. We understand that what was a journey of discovery for one group was the beginning of an era of immense suffering and loss for another. The legacy of this period is not just found in textbooks, but in the languages we speak, the food we eat, and the genetic tapestry of our global population. It is in the enduring struggles of indigenous peoples to reclaim their heritage and the fight against racial injustice that stems directly from the transatlantic slave trade. The story of the exploration of the New World is a testament to human ambition and resilience, but it also serves as a powerful reminder of the terrible consequences that can follow when discovery is pursued without humanity. This is a history we are still reckoning with, a story that continues to shape our world, a lesson that we must never forget. Thank you for joining me.